The amber liquid caught the chandelier light as it fell, creating 1,000 tiny prisms before it splashed across Dr. Simone Laurent's cream-colored Dior gown. The ballroom of the Peninsula Hotel went silent in that particular way that happens when 300 people collectively inhale at the same moment, the kind of silence that precedes either laughter or horror, depending on how the next 10 seconds unfold. Victoria Ashford stood with the empty champagne flute still tilted in her hand, her diamonds catching the same light that had illuminated the beer now dripping from Simone's shoulders was onto the polished marble floor. Victoria's face was twisted into an expression that mixed disgust with satisfaction, the look of someone who just swatted an insect and felt righteously pleased about it. "That's what happens when people forget their place," Victoria announced to the frozen crowd, her voice carrying across the ballroom with the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for anything in her entire privileged life. "Charity events are for donors, not staff. Next time, wait until you're actually invited before you crash events that are clearly above your station." Simone stood perfectly still, beer dripping from her hair onto her face, her expression unreadable. She didn't reach for a napkin, didn't wipe her eyes, just stood there looking at Victoria Ashford with the kind of calm that people mistake for weakness when it's actually the opposite. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear enough that every single person in that ballroom heard it. "Mrs. Ashford, my name is Dr. Simone Laurent. I'm the CEO of Laurent Defense Systems. And as of 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, I was scheduled to announce that your husband's company, Ashford Technologies, had won the $5.5 billion contract to build the next generation of satellite defense systems for the United States Department of Defense. Was scheduled. If that opening just sent electricity through your entire body, if you can already feel where this story is going, and you're here for every second of it, then hit that like button right now. Share this with everyone who needs to see what happens when arrogance meets consequence, when racism crashes into reality, when someone who's been underestimated reveals exactly how much power they actually hold." Subscribe to Acts of Depth because we tell the stories about the precise moment when tables turn, when justice arrives, not someday, but right now, when the universe delivers karma so perfectly timed it feels scripted. Now let me take you back to understand how Dr. Simone Laurent came to be standing in that ballroom covered in beer, and why what happened next would become the most expensive mistake Victoria Ashford would ever make. Simone Laurent had built Laurent Defense Systems from absolutely nothing over the course of 18 years. She'd started as a mechanical engineer fresh out of MIT with a PhD in aerospace systems and a head full of ideas about how to make satellite defense more efficient and less vulnerable to emerging threats. She'd spent 5 years working for established defense contractors where she'd been the only black woman in rooms full of white men who assumed she was there to take notes or serve coffee, who talked over her in meetings and took credit for her innovations, who promoted less qualified colleagues and told her to be patient when she asked why. She documented everything, built a case, filed complaints with HR that went nowhere because the company's general counsel was the brother-in-law of the executive who was the worst offender. So she'd quit, walked away from a six-figure salary and the illusion of stability to start her own firm with $40,000 in savings and a spare bedroom converted into an office. The first 3 years had been brutal. She'd pitched to venture capitalists who couldn't see past her gender and race to understand the revolutionary nature of her technology. She'd worked 18-hour days writing proposals and building prototypes and teaching herself business development because she couldn't afford to hire anyone. She'd maxed out credit cards and borrowed money from her parents who'd already sacrificed everything to put her through school. And she'd refused to give up even when every rational voice in her head screamed that she should go back to corporate work and accept that some battles couldn't be won. The breakthrough had come in year 4 when a mid-level Pentagon procurement officer named James Chen had actually read her proposal, instead of dismissing it based on the fact that her company had 5 employees and operated out of a rented warehouse in suburban Maryland. Chen had seen what the venture capitalists had missed, that Simone's satellite defense system was genuinely revolutionary, reducing vulnerability to cyber attacks by 87% while cutting operational costs by 40%. He'd given her a small contract to build a proof-of-concept system. She delivered it 6 weeks early and 30% under budget. It had performed exactly as promised during testing. And suddenly, Laurent Defense Systems wasn't a startup run by a black woman nobody took seriously. It was a company with a proven track record in technology the military wanted. The contracts had grown from there. Small projects became medium ones. Medium ones became large. By year 10, Laurent Defense Systems employed 300 people and had annual revenue of $400 million. By year 15, it was 800 employees and $1 billion in revenue. And 3 months ago, the Department of Defense had announced a competition for the largest satellite defense contract in a decade, a $5.5 billion project to build and deploy the next generation system that would protect American satellites from the increasing threat of anti-satellite weapons being developed by adversarial nations. 15 companies had submitted proposals. 3 had been selected as finalists after a grueling evaluation process. Laurent Defense Systems was one of them. Ashford Technologies was another. And Simone had spent the past 90 days in the most intense evaluation process of her career, defending every aspect of her technical approach and cost structure and management plan to committees of experts who had the power to choose who got to build the future of American space defense. The decision had been made 2 weeks ago. Simone knew because she'd been in the room when the Secretary of Defense had reviewed the final evaluation and made the call. Laurent Defense Systems had won. Her technology was superior. Her cost estimate was realistic rather than artificially low. Her track record of delivery was spotless. The formal announcement was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. during a press conference at the Pentagon. Simone would stand at a podium and answer questions about how her system worked and what this meant for national security. Ashford Technologies would issue a statement congratulating the winner and expressing disappointment. And then $5.5 billion would flow into Laurent Defense Systems over the next 7 years, cementing Simone's company as one of the premier defense contractors in the country and setting her up for even larger contracts in the future. But nobody outside of a small group of Pentagon officials knew the decision yet. The contract award was classified until the formal announcement, which meant that when Simone had arrived at the Peninsula Hotel for the annual Children's Defense Fund charity gala, she'd been one of only 3 people in that ballroom who knew she'd just won the biggest contract of her career. William Ashford, CEO of Ashford Technologies, had been another. He'd received notification that his company had lost the competition 3 hours earlier, and he was not handling it well. Simone had watched him across the ballroom during cocktail hour, knocking back scotch and speaking in urgent tones to board members and executives who'd flown in for what was supposed to be a celebration. His face was red, his gestures were sharp and frustrated, and his wife Victoria was clearly trying to manage him, keeping her hand on his arm and steering him away from conversations that looked like they might turn into scenes. Simone had felt a moment of professional sympathy. Losing a $5.5 billion contract was devastating for any company. Ashford Technologies had built their entire strategic plan around winning this award. They'd hired engineers in anticipation of the work, promised shareholders that revenue would triple, made commitments they'd now have to walk back. But that sympathy had evaporated when Victoria Ashford had approached Simone at the bar. Simone had been ordering a glass of water, having already decided to skip alcohol since she needed to be sharp for tomorrow's announcement. Victoria had stepped up beside her, close enough that Simone could smell her perfume. "Excuse me," something Victoria expensive had said, and overpowering. Her tone, the particular kind of condescending that rich white women reserve for service workers. "I need another champagne and my glass is empty. Could you get that for me?" Simone had turned to look at Victoria, taking in the 10-carat diamond necklace and the designer gown that probably cost more than most people's cars. "I'm not a server," she'd said politely. "I'm a guest, but the bartender will be happy to help you." Victoria's expression had shifted from entitled to offended. "A guest? At this event? I don't think so. This is a $5,000 a plate charity gala. The only black people here are staff. So stop pretending you belong and get me a drink." The assumption had landed like a slap, not because it was the first time Simone had experienced someone assuming she was staff based on her race. She'd lost count of how many times that had happened over her career. But because Victoria had said it so casually, so confidently, without even considering that she might be wrong. Simone had felt the familiar calculation running through her head. Option 1, educate this woman, explain who she was, watch Victoria backtrack and apologize while secretly believing she'd made an honest mistake instead of revealing her racism. Option 2, walk away and let Victoria discover her error on her own eventually. Option 3, call her out publicly and create a scene that would overshadow the charity event and make Simone look like the problem. She'd been weighing these options when William Ashford had appeared beside his wife, recognizing Simone immediately. "Victoria, this is Dr. Simone Laurent," he'd said tightly. "She's the CEO of Laurent Defense Systems, one of the companies that competed for the satellite defense contract." Victoria's face had gone through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, embarrassment, defensiveness. But instead of apologizing, she doubled down. "Well, you certainly don't look like a CEO. I mean, what are you even wearing? That dress is far too casual for an event like this. And you're at the bar instead of at a table, which suggests you probably couldn't actually afford the donation to attend. So forgive me for assuming you were working instead of crashing." Simone had looked down at her Dior gown, the one she'd spent $3,000 on specifically for this event, and felt the anger start to build beneath her professional composure. But before she could respond, William had made everything worse. "Victoria, please. Dr. Laurent doesn't understand our disappointment about the contract situation. She thinks she's won something. She has no idea what real power looks like or how these decisions actually get made." He turned to Simone with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The Pentagon announcement tomorrow is just for show. These contracts get decided in private conversations between people who matter. Your little company might have the best technology, but that's not what wins in our world. It's about relationships, access, knowing the right people, and those are things you'll never have." That's when Victoria had picked up the beer glass someone had left on the bar and poured it over Simone's head. Not in a moment of rage, deliberately, making eye contact the whole time, establishing dominance the way bullies do when they believe they're untouchable. And the ballroom had gone silent. Simone had stood there letting the beer drip off her designer gown and thought about her parents, about her father who'd been a postal worker for 40 years, and her mother who'd cleaned houses to help pay for Simone's education, about the sacrifices they'd made and the dignity they'd maintained even when the world tried to strip it from them, about the lesson her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old and came home crying because a teacher had told her that black girls didn't become engineers. "Baby," her mother had said, "people will underestimate you your whole life. Let them. And then prove them wrong so thoroughly that they can never forget how wrong they were." Standing in that ballroom covered in beer with 300 people watching, Simone had decided it was time to prove Victoria Ashford wrong in a way she would never forget. "Mrs. Ashford," she'd said in that quiet, clear voice that carried across the silent ballroom, "my name is Dr. Simone Laurent. I'm the CEO of Laurent Defense Systems. And as of 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, I was scheduled to announce that your husband's company, Ashford Technologies, had won the $5.5 billion contract to build the next generation of satellite defense systems for the United States Department of Defense. Was scheduled." She'd watched Victoria's face change as the words registered, watched William go pale, watched the crowd lean forward trying to understand what they were witnessing. You see, the selection committee didn't actually choose Ashford Technologies. They chose my company, my technology, my team. We won on merit, but the Secretary of Defense wanted to soften the blow for your husband since Ashford Technologies is a legacy contractor with long relationships in the Pentagon. So the plan was to let him save face tomorrow by having him announce he was graciously accepting the role of subcontractor on my prime contract, maintaining a small piece of the work to preserve those relationships you mentioned. Simone had pulled her phone from her evening bag, the screen lighting up her face in the dim ballroom. "But you've just given me clarity about who I want representing my company in relationships with other contractors. And that's not Ashford Technologies. So I'm making a call right now to the Secretary of Defense to recommend we remove your husband's company from the subcontractor role entirely. Your $500 million piece of this contract is about to become $0 because you poured beer on my head and assumed I was staff." She dialed the number while 300 people watched in complete silence. The call had lasted 90 seconds. Simone had explained the situation calmly and professionally, mentioned that she had witnesses and that the incident had been captured on multiple phone cameras, and requested that Ashford Technologies be removed from any role in the contract immediately. The Secretary of Defense had agreed without hesitation, noting that conduct unbecoming a contractor was grounds for exclusion and that he'd authorize the paperwork tonight so the announcement tomorrow would reflect the change. When Simone had ended the call, she'd looked at Victoria and William Ashford and seen the exact moment they understood what had just happened. $500 million. Gone. Because Victoria had assumed a black woman at a charity gala must be there to serve drinks. Because William had believed relationships mattered more than merit. Because they'd both been so certain that people like Simone would never have real power that they'd felt comfortable being cruel in public. The ballroom had erupted, not in applause or condemnation, but in that chaotic buzz of 300 people all trying to process the same shocking information at the same time. Simone had walked to the ladies' room with as much dignity as she could muster while covered in beer, and she'd stood at the sink washing her face and trying to stop her hands from shaking. A woman had entered behind her, an older black woman Simone vaguely recognized from the nonprofit boards Victoria Ashford used to burnish her social credentials. "I've been watching Victoria treat people like that for 20 years," the woman had said quietly. "She's been protected by her husband's money and her social position and the fact that nobody with power ever called her out. Thank you for finally doing it. Thank you for having the courage and the leverage to make it cost her something." Simone had looked at her reflection in the mirror, at the streaks of beer still in her hair and the ruined $3,000 gown. "I didn't do it for courage," she'd said. "I did it because I'm tired. Tired of being underestimated. Tired of being disrespected. Tired of watching people like Victoria face no consequences for racism because the system protects them. I had power in that moment, and I used it. That's not courage. That's just finally being in a position where I could." The woman had smiled. "That's exactly what courage is. Power without the willingness to use it is just potential. You turn potential into action. And tomorrow morning, you're going to stand at that Pentagon podium and show every young black girl watching that we can be CEOs and win billion-dollar contracts and hold people accountable when they treat us as less than human. That matters more than you know." Simone had returned to the ballroom wearing a borrowed jacket over her ruined dress, and she'd stayed for the rest of the gala because leaving would have looked like retreat. She'd stood at her table and made small talk with other contractors and Pentagon officials who'd all heard what happened and were processing it in various ways. Some were supportive, expressing outrage at Victoria's behavior. Others were uncomfortable, changing the subject quickly as if racism was too impolite to discuss at a charity event. And a few were clearly worried, calculating whether what Simone had done would be seen as professional or vindictive, whether using personal offense as grounds to alter a contract decision would create problems down the line. But Simone knew her decision would withstand scrutiny. Conduct of contractors mattered. Character mattered. And a company whose leadership publicly humiliated a competitor based on race was not a company the Pentagon wanted associated with national security programs. The legal justification was solid. The optics were defensible. And most importantly, it was the right thing to do. William Ashford had left the gala immediately after Simone's phone call, his face ashen and his gait unsteady. Victoria had stayed longer, holding court with her social circle and spinning a version of events where she'd made an innocent mistake and Simone had overreacted for political purposes. But the story Victoria was telling didn't match the video that was already circulating on social media, captured with a dozen phones and uploaded before the champagne glasses had even been cleared from the cocktail tables. By midnight, the hashtag was trending. By morning, it was national news. The Pentagon press conference happened exactly as scheduled at 8 a.m. Simone stood at the podium in a navy suit, her hair professionally styled, every inch the CEO of a company about to receive a $5.5 billion contract. She answered technical questions about her satellite defense system. She discussed the timeline for deployment and the number of jobs the contract would create. And when a reporter asked about the incident at the charity gala, she answered with the same calm she'd displayed while covered in beer. "Last night I experienced the kind of casual racism that black professionals face regularly, but rarely have the platform or power to address publicly. Mrs. Victoria Ashford assumed I was staff at a charity event because she couldn't imagine a black woman belonging there as a donor and guest. When corrected, instead of apologizing, she escalated by publicly humiliating me. That behavior demonstrated a lack of judgment and character that would be unacceptable in any contractor associated with programs as sensitive as national defense. So I recommended to the Secretary of Defense that Ashford Technologies be removed from any role in this contract. He agreed, and we moved forward with a team of subcontractors who share our values of professionalism, respect, and merit-based evaluation. The reporter had followed up, asking if Simone wasn't concerned about appearing vindictive or letting personal feelings influence professional decisions. Simone had looked directly at the camera and said something that would be quoted in business schools and leadership seminars for years afterward. There is nothing unprofessional about refusing to work with people who treat you as subhuman. There is nothing vindictive about enforcing consequences for racism. And there is nothing personal about expecting basic respect and dignity in professional relationships. Mrs. Ashford made a choice last night. I made a choice in response. Those choices have consequences. That's not vindictiveness. That's accountability. The story dominated the news cycle for 3 days. Think pieces were written about racism in professional spaces and whether Simone's response was appropriate. Victoria Ashford gave an interview to a sympathetic conservative outlet claiming she'd been the victim of cancel culture and that Simone was playing the race card to gain competitive advantage. But that narrative fell apart when additional witnesses came forward describing years of similar behavior from Victoria. Other black professionals she'd insulted or dismissed or treated as invisible at events where she assumed she was among only white peers. The accumulation of evidence painted a picture of someone whose racism wasn't a one-time mistake, but a pattern of behavior enabled by wealth and social position. Ashford Technologies stock dropped 17% in the week following the incident as investors calculated the impact of losing not just the $500 million subcontract, but the reputation damage that would make future Pentagon contracts harder to win. The board of directors issued a statement distancing the company from Victoria's personal conduct. William Ashford issued a public apology that read like it had been written by lawyers trying to avoid a discrimination lawsuit. And Victoria herself eventually released a statement that managed to apologize without actually admitting what she'd done wrong. The kind of non-apology that satisfied nobody, but allowed her to claim she'd taken responsibility. None of it mattered to Simone. The contract was signed, the work was beginning, and Laurent Defense Systems was positioned to become one of the most important defense contractors in the country. 6 months later, Simone stood in the control center, watching the first satellite her company had built launch into orbit. The rocket lifted off from Cape Canaveral in a pillar of flame and smoke, carrying 2 years of work and innovation into space. Her team cheered as the satellite separated from the rocket and began transmitting data back to Earth, confirming that every system was functioning exactly as designed. Simone thought about the journey that had led to this moment, the years of being underestimated and dismissed, the nights of doubt when she'd wondered if she should just give up and go back to working for someone else's dream instead of building her own, the casual cruelties and blatant racism she'd endured from people who thought their position insulated them from consequences. And she thought about Victoria Ashford, who'd probably never connected the beer she'd poured with the satellite now orbiting overhead, who'd likely convinced herself that she'd been unfairly punished for a minor social mistake rather than held accountable for revealing who she really was. The satellite transmitted its first encrypted message, a test of the revolutionary security protocols Simone had designed. The message was 5 words chosen by Simone as a private reminder of what this moment represented. They underestimated the wrong one. Her deputy, a young black woman engineer who had joined the company fresh out of grad school, read the message and smiled. "Boss, that's perfect. Should we make it our unofficial company motto?" Simone laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd had in months. "No, because the point isn't to prove people wrong. The point is to build something so good that eventually it doesn't matter what they thought. The satellite works. The contract is being delivered ahead of schedule and under budget. That's the answer to every person who assumed I didn't belong. Not anger, not revenge, just excellence they can't ignore or explain away. But excellence wasn't the same as forgetting. Simone kept a photograph in her office, taken by someone at the charity gala on the night Victoria Ashford had poured beer on her head. The photo showed Simone standing in her ruined Dior gown, beer dripping from her hair, her expression calm and focused as she made the phone call that would cost Ashford Technologies $500 million. Under the photo was a quote from her mother that Simone had remembered in that moment. Dignity isn't something someone can take from you. It's something you choose to maintain no matter what they do. Looking at that photo reminded Simone that the worst moments could become pivot points. That being underestimated was only a weakness if you believed the people who were doing the underestimating. That power revealed itself not in never being disrespected, but in how you responded when you were. Victoria Ashford had poured beer on Simone's head, expecting humiliation and compliance. She'd gotten accountability and consequences. That was justice. Not perfect, not complete, but real. The kind of justice that changed one contract decision and maybe made the next Victoria Ashford think twice before assuming the black woman in the room was there to serve instead of lead. The kind of justice that told young engineers that excellence and integrity mattered more than connections and conformity. The kind of justice that proved you could build something extraordinary from nothing if you refused to let other people's assumptions define your ceiling. The satellite orbiting overhead was proof. $5.5 billion in contracts was proof. 300 employees was proof. And the fact that Simone had built all of it while maintaining her dignity in the face of people who didn't think she deserved any was the greatest proof of all. If you stayed with this story to the end, you understand something crucial about power and dignity and the long arc of justice. Dr. Simone Laurent didn't destroy Victoria Ashford's life with that phone call. She simply held her accountable for publicly revealing who she was. She used the power she'd earned through 18 years of excellence to enforce consequences that should have existed all along. And she proved that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building something so successful that the people who tried to diminish you become footnotes in your story instead of obstacles in your path. Share this with everyone who's ever been underestimated or dismissed or assumed to be less than they are based on what they look like. Subscribe to Acts of Depth because we'll keep telling the stories about moments when tables turn, when assumptions shatter, when the person someone thought was powerless reveals exactly how much power they actually hold. Victoria Ashford poured beer on a woman she assumed was a server at a charity gala. That woman was actually the CEO about to award a $5.5 billion contract. The mistake cost Victoria's family $500 million and their reputation. But the larger cost was missing the lesson entirely, never understanding that the issue wasn't one phone call or one contract. It was a lifetime of treating people as if their humanity was conditional on meeting your expectations of who deserved respect. Simone learned that lesson young and built her entire career on refusing to accept it.